Hey, okay, week 10. It's week 10 already. Can you believe it? Hopefully, you're all hanging in there and doing all right. If you ever have any problems, please get in touch with me and just let me know. We're definitely closer to the end now than to the beginning. I may just reach out to some of you too, just to see how things are going. But anyway, for this week then, week 10, we're talking about science. Now, we already have been in effect. Here it's just a little more explicit, and in particular in terms of what is sometimes described as feminist empiricism, so sort of a feminist approach to empirical science. Empirical science is very important to feminism. It's very important to everything in the modern world. Science is considered kind of, the highest standard of knowledge, basically, sort of the best kind of knowledge there could be, true knowledge in the strongest sense. Yeah, so we take the results or the content of such science very, very seriously. So in particular, should it ever happen that the results or the content of science are actually inconsistent with something we desire, inconsistent, say, with some part of a political agenda, say, of something like feminism, then that can be really quite significant, right? If science, or the results or the content of science seem to say something to the effect of, say, whatever, men have better spatial abilities, and that's why most architects are men, that could be a problem from the perspective of feminism. Or if science seemed to say that young children need their mothers to stay at home and not work, that could be a problem. If it was taken to suggest that there shouldn't be, say, any public funding for daycare or something like that, that could be quite significant. So science is very, very important. Basically, though, what has happened, and there's many documented cases, of pointing out different kinds of bias, masculinist or androcentric bias in science, such that the results of that we might have thought initially were good science weren't actually very good at all, and we can dismiss them in that way. But basically, that doesn't always go in that way. So what we have in the first text, there's two texts this week, one from Helen Longino and the other from Sharon Crasnow. They're very different. The first is what we really want to focus on, actually, from Longino, a little bit of older piece. Basically, she might be suspicious, she thinks. That's kind of what some people might have tried to do, just kind of recognize that we think there's biases in this or that area of scientific inquiry. And we want to just try to correct for that. And so we might try to take sort of a more direct approach to bringing about some kind of science that would indeed produce the sort of results that we think are unbiased and more amenable to our desired outcomes, you might say. She's kind of suspicious of that, and I guess rightly so. That doesn't seem quite like a very sound approach to doing science. So she's got a very strong respect for science, as I think people like Hartsock, and as we'll see in a couple of weeks, Sandra Harding. Very strong respect for science, but nonetheless does think that there is something wrong. Now, where she thinks the problem lies is more in what she'll call the practice of science, and she wants to focus her attention there. And like how it is being done at a more kind of meta level, you might say, and try to make a change there. The main thing she wants to do, actually, is to tackle, or to question what has long been an article of faith, you might say, in the scientific community, and that is that science, when it's properly science, when it's good science, it's value neutral science, basically, right? It's supposed to be conducted in such a way that various kinds of social values that may play a role in other areas of life shouldn't play a role in science. Those are to be excluded, kind of methodically excluded from the scientific process and scientific methods, and that's how we're supposed to ensure that we really get good results, objective results. Now, her point is basically just to recognize something, which is not her own discovery by any means. It's a fairly widely held view in the philosophy of science. And this is usually called the underdetermination thesis. This is the view that empirical science, the results, the conclusions we draw, the theories we formulate, are in principle never, ever fully determined by the data, or by the observations, by the empirical evidence that we have available, right? Basically, we can always draw different conclusions, any number, in principle, any number. Some may not seem very likely to be true, but there's typically more than one way to interpret the data, more than one way to draw conclusions. That's just a fact. And she thinks what this means is that when we do have scientific results in a determinate form, it's only because certain other kinds of values, these are the ones she calls contextual as opposed to constitutive. So constitutive values, I should have said this before, those are the ones really just internal to science, logical consistency, explanatory completeness, basic things like that. She's saying even with those values, right, those constitutive values of rational inquiry, right, there's always this underdetermination of the results, right? To get determined results or determinate results always means, whether we know it or not, that external values, these contextual or social values, have always kind of worked their way into the process. So in general, when science has taken itself to be pursuing and to be, maybe successfully achieving a value-neutral approach and value-neutral conclusions, they've actually never done that. It's just that there's certain values that are very ubiquitous in a society characterized by sexist oppression. Those biases have actually got into the process and are kind of inscribed in those very results. And so she thinks that's basically how we can describe the problem. The solution part is basically to recognize that we can use other contextual values. Right? It's unavoidable that some kind of contextual values will be involved. It's unavoidable. To get determinate results, we always need to sort of have recourse to this or that kind of social or contextual values. She thinks the ones that have typically been turned to, even if people weren't even doing this self-consciously, are problematic. They're not that good, right? And we can actually do better, right? And do better from the perspective of science itself. Do better science when we actually use other kinds of values. So, for example, she gives a kind of extended example, which is, I think, a very good one, I guess. So it's not just, what we might immediately think of as, say, a value, but she's thinking about how we construct our models, how we try to explain and account for the data. She was talking about some research in, I don't know what she calls it, neurophysiology or something, kind of about the effects of different levels of hormones on human development in utero, those effects on later behavior and so on. And her point was just basically to say that it was quite typical that there'd be a very simplistic model between sort of the observed differences on the one hand being connected up with other observed differences in terms of behavior later on. And her point was just to say you could do a much better job, basically, when you tried to construct a model that was premised on an understanding of human development that was just more complex, that took account of different forms of interaction with other people, with society, with our environments, and so on. And you could probably come up with a much sounder, much more insightful interpretation and understanding of those results. So in terms of like a value, she's saying, it's a certain kind of value to see, that human beings are not just objects. We're not just, as simplistic organisms or anything else, but we can have much more complex models based on the fact that we do kind of pursue our own lives, we make choices and so on. Things are much more complex, and that can actually get worked into our theories, basically. What you can actually see in that example, just kind of glimpse a little bit, is kind of a feminist commitment to the possibility of changing things, right? Whereas the other, much more simplistic model tend to just have implications of reinforcing the status quo. So that's the way a certain different value kind of gets worked into the scientific process. We think about the results and try to understand them in a different way. And that, right, can actually then lead to different results which might be much more supportive of feminist goals and aims. So it's in that way that toward the end, not at the very end, but nearer the end, there's a certain line, and this is what I flagged in the assignment for this week. Basically, she wants to say this is a much better way to go, right? When we focus on scientific practice in this kind of way, we will get differences in terms of content, right? The results will be different, not just because we kind of immediately make them so. We just sort of stipulate that the results of science should be consistent with our own views. That's kind of a shortcut that we shouldn't take. Rather, we try to reform or revise scientific practice in certain ways, just recognize that there are certain values, that might guide us in other areas of life, which might do very well in the scientific field as well, right? And get better results even when considered in terms of what science itself is really supposed to be doing. Anyway, I've gone on over 10 minutes apparently, so I'm going to be super quick on the other one. I was intending to be quick anyways on the Crasnow. It's a very different kind of article. It's a much more recent kind of survey. It's not so much that she's doing some research herself. She's kind of reporting on others. So in this case, it's feminist empiricism, for example, Helen Longino, and standpoint theory, kind of like Hartsock we were seeing last week, and kind of comparing and contrasting them. So we'll be talking about this. It's just useful, the terms that she does this in terms of what we can think of as, on the one hand, neutrality, on the other hand, impartiality. And the key difference lies there. They would both agree, actually, that, feminist science cannot be neutral. They would probably say that no science ever is really neutral. It's just a question, say, of which kinds of values are going to guide it best. So they could agree with that. But someone like Longino is thinking that, yes, we can be non-neutral in that way, yet still be impartial in the way that science really ought to be. And it's basically in that respect that standpoint theory is a little bit different in terms of thinking that certain standpoints really make a difference. They are saying that it really makes a difference who is doing this. Strictly speaking, for Longino, anybody could do it. If they just have the right kind of attitudes or the right views, she thinks anybody could do it. There's no implication there that anything would necessarily be different if all scientists were women, for example, or half were women, or certain fields had many, many more women. That may not necessarily make a difference in her view. And everything could be okay, quite irrespective of that, so long as some of those reforms were put into place, and that is possible without necessarily having women do it. Whereas with the standpoint approach, it's much, much more important, and there is something crucial about actual experience that the individuals directly involved have had. Their actual standpoint is going to make a difference, basically. At least, say, maybe in the longer term for how different sciences may go on and develop in the future. All right, basically the key thing has to be, what we really consider to be, say, the real, say, questions to address, and what actually are the relevant things to consider. That a difference can be made from one's own experience, whether or not something is to be taken into account or not, or how the scientific process would actually unfold, could make a difference. It could be done differently depending really on who is doing it, and that's the side that gets emphasized more in the standpoint side of things. But anyway, we'll be talking more about that as we go. We got a little bit more to talk about with some standpoint stuff with Harding as well. I think that's next week or the week after. But for now, for this week, focus mostly on the Longino. Maybe give the Crasnow a quick read because it's kind of useful and so on. But we're going to focus mostly on the Longino for now. All right.